What if a single sentence could freeze an entire room, rendering even the most seasoned diplomat speechless? This is exactly what happened mere minutes ago in a hidden chamber where crucial decisions ripple across continents. A tense silence fell over the hall as a powerful figure from the east confronted the leader of a powerful alliance. What was said that stopped the Secretary-General of NATO dead in his tracks? In an imposing hall, with towering arches echoing every word and step, men in tailored suits sat along a long polished table. Their faces were taut, carefully cloaked beneath diplomatic masks honed by years of guarded negotiations. Only one stood apart, a man known worldwide, whose calm gaze bore the weight of decades and sharp strategic foresight. His presence alone commanded respect without a shred of pretense or brashness. Sergei Lavrov sat straight-backed, motionless but alert. His dark suit was simple yet impeccably fitted. A deep burgundy tie contrasted with the faint pallor of his face, where wrinkles told tales of endless talks, battles fought without guns, with outcomes hanging between victory and defeat. In him was no act, no forced toughness. He embodied measured diplomacy, carved and sharpened over time. Opposite him sat Mark Rutte, the European Prime Minister. His forced smile stretched too wide across a face shadowed by unease. His fingers tapped nervously on a folder, his jacket seeming hastily tailored, the collar of his shirt just a bit too tight. Beneath the surface, a flicker of worry flashed in his eyes. He knew exactly what verbal battlefield awaited him. The air itself seemed thick and tangible, heavy with the gravity of what was to come. This was no public spectacle, no journalists were allowed in. Only the voices of those who shape continents filled this chamber, in a meeting that history itself may one day call secret, though secrets of such magnitude are rarely contained. Lavrov inclined his head slowly, a gesture both courteous and deliberate. He began in a low, slightly hoarse tone, "Mark, you are a learned man. Do you like history? Allow me to remind you." A brief pause, each word carefully sinking into the silence around them. He recalled the early 1990s, when the Soviet Union fell apart and promises were made, no expansion of military blocs eastward, no NATO borders creeping closer. Instead, a vision of a new Europe, unified and free of dividing lines. Rutte raised an eyebrow, about to object. But Lavrov's voice deepened, dragging decades of history with it. And yet, what happened? Each decade, NATO's lines inched relentlessly closer to Russia's borders. Each summit ended with more new members welcomed. What began as a friendly handshake turned into a clenched fist raised in Russia's face. Those words hung in the charged air, silence swallowing every other sound, even the hum of ventilation vanished. Rutte finally spoke, his voice hollow and uncertain. "Sergei, the world has changed. Circumstances are different now. We face new threats." But his words lacked conviction, no facts anchored them. Even he seemed to feel the fragility in his stance. Without raising his voice, Lavrov leaned forward, calm but unwavering. "Allow me to remind you something else. After World War II, Stalin offered to build a system of collective security with the West, a united structure. Back then, it was still possible to avoid a divided Europe, to stop the arms race and the Cold War from hardening. But you refused. And what did that bring? Decades of fear, billions spent on missiles and tanks, families torn apart by walls and barbed wire." Rutte swallowed hard, his gaze shifting away. The folder in his hands trembled as he gripped it tighter, clinging to paper that suddenly seemed meaningless. Lavrov's words echoed beyond the room, speaking to history itself, to the memory of millions. 27 million lives lost in the Second World War. Mark, those aren't numbers. Those were families, children, cities wiped from the map. It was Soviet soldiers who stopped the darkness from descending on Europe. It was they who pushed death beyond your borders. And now you speak to us of trust? Rutte's silence was an admission in itself. His nod was not a sign of agreement, but defeat. A silence louder than words took hold. Lavrov slowly raised his hand and pointed to an old map. Its edges were worn, the boundary lines marked in stark black. But the real story was in the rings plotted on the map, the waves of NATO expansion. Look here, Mark, Lavrov said, voice steady like a professor revealing a simple truth. With every decade, your base is pushed closer. Promises broken for Poland, the Czech Republic, Hungary, the Baltic states, and now, right at our doorstep. He paused, letting the weight of the image settle into the minds around the table. Tell me honestly, if Russia placed military bases near the American coasts today, would you see it as a gesture of friendship, or as a threat? Ruda opened his mouth, but no words came. His cheeks flushed faintly. He knew the answer sounded pitiful. Another long pause fell. Every diplomat shifted their gaze between Lavrov and Ruda, the contrast impossible to ignore. For the Western Prime Minister, it was an uncomfortable comparison. Lavrov straightened, pushed the map aside. You imposed sanctions, he said. They were supposed to strike Russia. But in truth, you struck yourselves. Energy prices soared, factories shuttered, millions of Europeans struggled to pay bills. And all this, for what? To fuel a myth you created, a threat you manufactured. His voice softened, almost intimate. Who really benefits from this, Mark? He looked directly into his opponent's eyes. Nothing but silence answered. In that silence, hearts pounded louder than words. Lavrov exhaled and reclined. The Soviet Union once dreamed of a united European home, no walls, no wire fences, where people could grow together. But you chose walls. You chose blocks, divisions. Ruda gathered his strength. The world changed, Sergei. We cannot live in the past. We need new approaches, new guarantees. Yet his voice sounded rehearsed, empty of real conviction or warmth. Leaning forward again, Lavrov spoke softly, but every word stabbed the air like a sharp blade. My father fought so that we might sit together today. He shed blood so Europe would never see war again. But your leaders have forgotten the sacrifice of ordinary soldiers. He paused. The silence speaking volumes. The room froze. Ruda said no more. His eyes lowered, hands gripping the folder, waiting for the meeting to end. Far outside the grand hall, bells tolled, echoing faintly yet profoundly, underscoring every unspoken word and pregnant pause. A subtle chill of fatigue drifted through the room. Such conversations rarely conclude quickly. Every word carved with care, every silence pregnant with meaning. But here, in the stillness, politics faded into memory, beyond rules and documents. Lavrov's tired yet piercing eyes seemed to illuminate lost pages of history, drawing the room closer to truths buried by time. Mark, when I look at today, he began, I recall a different time. A time when the Soviet Union still stood. When senior diplomats whispered, the West promised. No written words, but all understood, a promise not to move eastward. He let the moment linger, inviting the room back decades before. It was a handshake, once a sign of trust. But over time, it became a clenched fist. His words were simple but heavy with the years lived since. Ruda's smile faltered, strained and artificial. It was long ago. No one foresaw what the future held. Lavrov mused softly. But therein lies the power of a promise, Mark. Trust in words. For Russia, what is said must align with action. We have relied on that. In harsh times, we shared our last. His voice softened, yet grew all the more piercing. Even during famine, the Soviet Union sent grain abroad. Do you remember that? We shared bread even when we had little. And what did we receive in return? Though quiet. His words carried a deeper charge than any accusation. Ruda sighed deeply, words failing him. We always believed security was the goal, he finally said. Security, Lavrov cut in, his tone firm and austere for the first time. Security bred from fear only creates new threats. You built walls without seeing, there are people behind those walls. You stationed bases, launched missiles, oblivious to the new spiral of distrust you ignited. The hall hung entranced, no one daring to interrupt. Lavrov rose slowly, hands resting on the chair's back as he scanned the room. I need you to understand this: Russia does not seek enemies. Russia seeks equal dialogue. We have always been part of Europe. We traded, built, and fought alongside you against common foes. We saved Europe when it teetered on the brink. What comes next? The story isn't finished. The echoes of these words will resonate much longer than this room's walls. The question remains: can these deep wounds of history ever truly heal? In a dimly lit chamber far removed from the hustle of the outside world, a clandestine meeting took place, destined to be called a secret in the annals of diplomacy. No reporters were present to capture the tension rising in the air, a thick blanket of anticipation wrapping around the room. The corners were filled with figures in suits, their expressions betraying the weight of their discussions. Among them sat Sergei Lavrov, a stalwart of international relations, exuding an aura of unflinching authority. His dark suit tailored to perfection contrasted sharply with the nervous energy radiating from his opponent, Mark Rutte, who fidgeted with a folder, the paper trembling under his fingertips. Rutte's jacket felt hastily crafted, pinching at his collar, a physical manifestation of his anxiety. He knew who he was up against, and the stakes had never felt higher. The air vibrated with intensity, palpable and almost suffocating as Lavrov inclined his head slightly, signaling the conversation to commence. "Mark," he began in a low, gravelly tone, "you are a man of education. Do you enjoy history? Allow me to remind you of a chapter you may have overlooked." A brief pause ensued, allowing the gravity of his words to sink in. He ventured back to the tumultuous early 90s, a time when the Soviet Union crumbled, and promises were made: there would be no eastward expansion of military alliances, no crossing into territories that could splinter the hopes for a unified Europe, a space without barriers. Rutte's brow arched, an instinctual response to argue forming on his lips. Yet Lavrov pressed on, his voice deepening as he shouldered the memories of decades past, each word steeped in the anguish of history. "What has transpired?" he challenged. "Every decade, your borders inched closer to ours. Each conference ended with decisions to usher in new allies to your fold. What began as a friendly handshake has been morphed into a fist raised against Russia." The metaphor lingered, thickening the silence. Even the hum of the ventilation system fell away in the weight of his statement. Rutte, collecting himself, finally responded, "Sergei, the world has changed." But his voice rang hollow, lacking conviction, as if he were the one still grappling with the impact of those shifting tides. Lavrov leaned forward, maintaining his composure. "Let me remind you of another pivotal moment. After the war, Stalin proposed a collective security framework alongside you, the Western nations, a chance for unity. You chose otherwise." He paused, his gaze penetrating. "In rejecting that vision, what did we gain? Decades of fear, billions spent on military might, families torn apart by walls and barbed wire." Rutte shifted uncomfortably, his eyes breaking away, as if the weight of history pressed heavily upon his shoulders. The folder in his hands trembled once more, grounding him in a reality that felt all too fragile. What if a single sentence could shatter a continent's diplomatic facade in 5 minutes, stopping a seasoned NATO chief dead in his tracks, forcing the whole assembly to hold its breath? Could a few carefully chosen words erase years of broken promises, redraw borders on a worn map, and make a power doubt its own strategy? Stay tuned to uncover the line that turned allies into adversaries. Previously, we heard how the West once pledged not to expand eastward, a promise that was later broken, leading to decades of fear, billions spent on missiles and tanks, and families torn apart by walls and barbed wire. In the dimly lit hall, the rustle of papers was the only sound. A folder trembled in RYT's hands, his fingers tightening around it as if the documents could still hold weight. Lavrov's voice cut through the tension, not just for his opponent but for history itself. "We lost 27 million lives in the Second World War," he said, each number hanging heavy in the air. 27 million mothers, children, cities that no longer exist. The room seemed to inhale the grief. He reminded them that a Soviet soldier had once driven the black flag off Europe, that sacrifice had expelled death beyond their borders. RYT could only nod. His nod was not agreement, it was the quiet acknowledgement of defeat. A thick silence followed, louder than any accusation. Lavrov raised a weathered map, its edges frayed, lines drawn in stark black. The map was more than geography, concentric rings traced NATO's relentless expansion. "Look, Mark," Lavrov whispered, calm as a professor revealing a simple truth. Every decade your bases moved a step closer, shifting the red line without asking, without consulting. He pointed to the rings, each one a silent claim. If Russia stationed forces on the U.S. coastline today, would you see it as friendship or threat? RYT's mouth opened, then closed. A faint flush rose on his cheeks. He sensed the futility of a response. The hall held its breath again, this time longer, as every diplomat's eyes darted between the two men. Lavrov pushed the map aside. "You imposed sanctions, calling them a blow to Russia," he continued, his tone firming. "But you struck yourselves, energy prices soaring, factories shuttering, millions unable to pay bills. All to uphold a myth of a threat you created." He leaned forward, voice dropping to an intimate whisper. "Who truly benefited, Mark?" The question hung, unfinished, as the faint scent of polished wood and cold steel filled the room. A pause stretched, the kind that makes a heart thud louder than words. Lavrov's gaze locked onto RYT's, demanding an answer that might never come. The map lay forgotten, the rings still glowing in the minds of those present. What will happen when the next word is spoken, and the silent deadline finally breaks? What if the sanctions meant to weaken a rival turned into a self-inflicted wound that crippled entire economies, left factories silent and millions scrambling for the next bill? Imagine a vaulted hall where every breath carries the weight of history, where a single phrase can echo louder than artillery. Earlier, a weary diplomat kept shifting his gaze between Lavrov and RYT, as the comparison grew too stark for the Western premier. Lavrov straightened, slid the map aside, and declared, "You imposed sanctions, but the blow landed on the architects themselves. Energy prices surged like a raging furnace, factories shuttered, their doors slamming shut with a hollow thud. Millions of households stare at empty wallets, wondering how to settle the next invoice. All of this, in the name of a phantom threat you yourself forged." His voice fell to a whisper, intimate as a secret shared in darkness. "Who truly gained, Mark?" he asked, his eyes fixed on the opponent's stare. Silence answered, a heavy, pulsing quiet that made hearts race faster than the ticking clock on the wall. Lavrov inhaled, then exhaled slowly, leaning back into his chair. He recalled the Soviet vision of a united European home, no walls, no barbed wire, peoples growing together in harmony. You chose fences instead, brick by brick, drawing sharp division lines across a continent. RYT finally gathered his composure. "The world has changed, Sergei. We cannot live in yesterday's shadows. We need fresh approaches, new guarantees," he said, his tone sounding like a rehearsed script, devoid of genuine conviction. Lavrov leaned forward, each word cutting the air like a blade. "My father fought so that we might sit together at this table today. He spilled blood to keep Europe from tasting a new war. Yet your leaders have forgotten the sacrifice of the ordinary soldier." He fell quiet, and the silence that followed was as expressive as any speech. The chamber seemed to freeze, even RYT ceased his objections. He lowered his gaze, rested his palms on the folder, and simply waited for the meeting's end. Beyond the massive windows, far away, bells tolled, a resonant chime that underscored every unspoken word and lingering pause. A faint chill of fatigue settled over the room. Diplomatic talks rarely end swiftly. Every sentence is weighed, each pause holds meaning. In that stillness, the discussion slipped from cold policy into the realm of collective memory, beyond papers and protocols. Lavrov lifted his eyes again, they were weary yet fierce, like spotlights seeking lost chapters in the darkness of history. He spoke once more, his tone softer yet piercing. "You remember the promise of the early 90s, when the West vowed not to push military blocs eastward, to spare a new Europe from division? Those pledges vanished as borders expanded, as bases crept nearer to our borders, as the red line was repeatedly crossed." He paused, allowing the map, its faded edges and stark black lines of NATO's expansion, to linger before RYT's eyes. If Russia were to station forces along your shores, would you see a gesture of partnership or a looming threat? RYT's mouth opened, then closed, a faint flush rose on his cheeks. The question hung, unanswered. As the room held its breath, Lavrov shifted the map aside, his hand steady. Sanctions you call a strike against Russia have backfired. Prices have exploded, factories crumble, citizens struggle. All to reinforce a myth of danger you yourself created. He leaned back, the scent of old leather filling the space. Who truly feels safer now, Mark? The question lingered, a crack in the facade, as the echo of distant bells reminded everyone that history, like a dying ember, never truly goes out. The room had fallen into a heavy silence, one that carried weight beyond ordinary diplomacy. This moment no longer belonged to politics alone. It had stepped into the realm of memory, where no documents or regulations could shield the truth. Sergei's gaze lifted slowly, eyes tired yet piercing, like beams cutting through the darkness, illuminating forgotten pages of history. He began quietly, his voice steady yet carrying the weight of decades. Do you know, Mark? His words hung in the air, inviting those present to travel back in time. When I reflect on what's happening now, I recall a different conversation. A conversation from the days when the Soviet Union still existed. He paused, as if inviting the room to step back into that distant era. I was a young diplomat then, overhearing senior colleagues say repeatedly, "The West promised." No paper recorded it, yet everyone understood, there was a promise not to advance further east. The thought settled among them like a slow-burning ember. It felt like a handshake, a sign of trust. But over time, that handshake had turned into a fist. His words were simple but carried the crushing weight of years gone by. Mark tried to smile, but it faltered, tense, almost like a mask that didn't quite fit. The past was distant. No one could have predicted what lay ahead. Sergei inclined his head gently. But that, Mark, is the power of a promise, the faith in the spoken word. For Russia, it has always been important that words align with actions. We are a people taught to trust. Even in hard times, we shared what little we had. His voice softened, yet became all the more piercing. Even during famine, the Soviet Union sent grain abroad. Do you remember that? We shared bread while we were hungry ourselves. And what did we receive in return? The accusation was quiet but thunderous, stronger than any loud blame. Mark exhaled heavily, weighed down by the absence of a defense. We always believed we acted for security, he murmured. But Sergei cut in, voice firmer than before, security built on fear only breeds new threats. You erected walls, forgetting people still live behind them. You placed bases, launched missiles, oblivious to the spiral of distrust you were creating. The assembly sat spellbound. No one interrupted. Slowly, Sergei rose, placing his hands on the back of his chair. His gaze swept over the room like a lighthouse seeking its shore. I want you to understand one thing, he said. Russia does not seek enemies. Russia seeks equal dialogue. The question lingered between them, urgent, raw, and unanswered. What kind of future could be built on broken words and shifting promises? And who would finally break the silence that hung heavy over the table? Outside, distant bells tolled softly, echoing through the cold air, the sound of history remembering itself. In a tense atmosphere, Sergei Lavrov rose from his seat, fixing his piercing gaze on the assembly before him, a mix of tension and anticipation hanging in the air. Let me make one thing clear, he stated firmly. Russia does not seek enemies. We seek equal dialogue. The room seemed to hold its breath, the air thick with emotion as he spoke of a shared history, where nations came together as one. We have always been part of Europe, he continued, his voice steady yet resonant with unspoken history. We traded together, built together, and fought against a common enemy. We saved Europe when its fate hung by a thread. And now, you wish to push us away, to separate us with walls. He let the words hang in the air, a riddle unanswered. Lavrov sat back down, a calm intensity radiating from him, a power stronger than any fiery rhetoric. In the 90s, we reached out. We suggested creating a common security architecture, free from the divisions of US and them. Imagine, Mark, we even contemplated joining NATO. Yes, this was a real possibility. We genuinely believed that by uniting our efforts, wars could become a thing of the past. But your response was to keep us on the outside. A soft rustle traveled through the room, a few diplomats exchanging glances, the unspoken topic now laid bare. Lavrov tilted his head slightly, as if listening to the echoes of his own thoughts. What's most bitter is that we continued to believe, he reflected. We traded, supported your economies. We extended our hand, stepping towards you, not retreating behind walls. Yet now, your military bases sit at our borders. And what do we receive in return? Sanctions instead of dialogue. He pointed once again to an old map, tracing its lines with his finger. It's like inviting a neighbor to dinner and then erecting new fences every night while rallying a mob outside their gate. You call this security, we call it a betrayal of trust. Mark's eyes lifted, but the confidence was replaced with uncertainty. His words became increasingly vague, struggling against the weight of Lavrov's assertiveness. The world is complex, he asserted. We can't reduce everything to a single narrative. We must consider many interests. His voice faltered, each word devoid of the vitality needed in such discussions, while Lavrov's voice rang like a clarion call, clear and profound. Walls won't protect you, Mark, he leaned in, the intensity in his gaze unwavering. Walls always crumble. History has shown us this, just as in Berlin. In a secluded chamber, tensions ran high as two formidable leaders faced off. Picture the atmosphere thick with anticipation, where each word could reshape alliances and histories. The stalwart Russian diplomat, Sergei Lavrov, commanded attention, his piercing gaze a mix of wisdom and unwavering confidence. Opposite him sat Mark Rutte, the European Prime Minister, his facade of a wide smile belying the unease beneath the surface. In this rare, closed-door meeting, Lavrov began with a chilling reminder of broken promises from decades past. Mark, you remember when the Soviet Union dissolved? His voice resonated, drawing everyone into the gravity of his message. We were promised that NATO would not expand eastward, that we would cooperate for a stable Europe. The air thickened as he laid bare the unfolding decades, each expansion of NATO inching closer to Russian borders, each friendly gesture morphing into a clenched fist. Rutte, now visibly unsettled, attempted a retort, Sergei, the world has changed. We face new threats now. But Lavrov, with unyielding calmness, leaned closer, revealing the ghosts of the past. After the war, Stalin proposed a collective security system, but you turned away. What have you gained since then? Silence enveloped the room, heavy with the weight of Lavrov's words. Every ear listened intently, the air turned electric as Lavrov unveiled a centuries-old map, its borders stark and worn. Mark, what if Russia positioned bases off the coast of the United States? Would that be seen as friendship or a threat? A gasp rippled through the gathered diplomats as Rutte's composure faltered, the question burning in the air. Lavrov, sensing the shift, pressed on, eerily calm, you impose sanctions as if they hurt only us, but it's you who suffers. Millions are left struggling and bewildered over decisions rooted in fear. The tension twisted tighter, as if time itself paused outside that chamber, rings echoing against ages of conflict. Memory, Mark, Lavrov continued softly, pulling out black and white photographs, memories of a war-torn past. He set them on the table like delicate artifacts. Each image tells a story of sacrifice, 27 million lives lost. Each represented a family, a future extinguished. Rutte's hands trembled as he leaned closer, grappling with the weight of history laid bare before him. Could he find the words to defend a legacy shrouded in guilt? That day, the diplomat's facade began to crack, the masks fading. Rutte stammered, we acknowledge the past, but his voice carried more like an echo of a reluctant truth than a firm conviction. As Lavrov collected the photographs, he said with raw intensity, "Memory isn't just etched on stone, Mark. It lives within us." With a silent understanding hanging in the air, the weight of unresolved histories loomed. Would they finally learn to stop building walls? Would they dare to transcend past betrayals? The room buzzed with potential answers lingering just out of reach, an unresolved chapter waiting to unfold. In a tense yet hushed atmosphere, the weight of words hung palpably in the air. The Prime Minister raised his gaze, displaying a flicker of embarrassment. "We value sacrifices. We remember." But those words rang hollow without conviction. Lavrov meticulously gathered the photographs, tucking them back into their folder. Memory. It's not just etched in stone but in actions. And today, your actions speak of new bases, new barriers, new sanctions. Is that respect for memory? Is that gratitude? These questions lingered, echoing like an indictment in the silence that enveloped the room. This time, the stillness was not empty, it was layered with memories and images just revealed. The very walls seemed to resonate with echoes of a time when Europe was a battlefield, not a diplomatic arena. Lavrov leaned forward slightly, softening his tone as if addressing not politicians, but the very people gathered there. "When I witness the new divisions being drawn, I wonder, is that why my father died? Is that why millions perished? They longed for a future in Europe, a common home. They did not sacrifice their lives to raise barriers again." He paused momentarily, allowing his words to settle like ashes in the air. "In the Soviet Union, we had a simple dream, a shared European home without barbed wire, free from suspicion. We once believed that this was possible. Yet, instead of constructing homes, you chose fences, opting for isolation over collaboration." His voice sliced through the air like a sharp blade, each word weighted with nostalgia. The Prime Minister pressed his hand against his chin, desperately trying to mask his inability to respond. He feigned contemplation, but everyone sensed the truth, his silence screamed louder than any retort. Lavrov cast his gaze toward the NATO expansion map remaining on the table. History does not tolerate forgetfulness. Those who overlook the lessons of the past are doomed to relive them. At that moment, even the previously stoic and indifferent felt the profound truth of his declaration. There were no threats here, no games. Just an undeniable reality that could not be dismissed behind protocol or diplomatic smiles. The room was frozen in an uneasy stillness, every eye was fixated on Lavrov. The Prime Minister kept his head down, acknowledging that further debate was futile. The air thickened, infused with an invisible dust of lingering memories that rose alongside voiced sentiments. In a tense meeting recently held behind closed doors, Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, left NATO Secretary-General Mark Rutte speechless. Lavrov's oratory not only captivated everyone present, but it also raised urgent questions about trust and historical commitments in international relations. What words did he say that stunned Rutte into silence? And why did they resonate so deeply? This story unveils a confrontation that transcends political posturing, probing into the heart of diplomacy. The gathering took place in a grand hall, where echoes of every word reverberated ominously, heightening the atmosphere. Around a long table, men in suits held tightly to their diplomatic facades, but one figure stood apart. Lavrov sat straight-backed, embodying decades of experience and an unsettling calm, like a chess master assessing his opponent's every move. His dark suit fit impeccably, allowing his presence to dominate the room without excess. Rutte, the European Prime Minister across the table, wore a strained smile, one that screamed unease. The tension in the air thickened, as neither side wanted to be the first to flinch. No journalists were privy to this encounter, it was a confidential affair destined to be dubbed a mystery in the annals of diplomacy. Yet, within this chamber, only the voices deciding the fate of continents filled the silence. Lavrov tilted his head slightly, indicating with a measured tone, "Mark, you are educated. You appreciate history, don't you? Let's revisit a promise made in the early 90s. His invitation hung in the air, setting the stage for revelations that would depart from mere political rhetoric. With deliberate pauses, he recounted a time when the Soviet Union faced dissolution, and Western powers assured that NATO would not expand further east. Ruda's eyebrows arched, ready to counter, but Lavrov's voice deepened, unveiling the weight of years gone by, and yet, decade after decade, you shifted your borders closer to ours. The tension was palpable. What began as friendly banter became a stark accusation of betrayal, an unsettling shift in the dynamic. As Ruda struggled to respond, Lavrov pressed on, his voice steady but laden with history. After the war, Stalin sought a joint security system with you and the West, but you rejected the idea. The crux of Lavrov's argument was both powerful and haunting. The consequences of that refusal echoed through generations, shaping a legacy of division and distrust. In a moment of vulnerability, Ruda attempted to retort, acknowledging, "The world has changed, Sergei. We face new threats." But his words felt hollow, lacking conviction as they faded into the charged air of the room. Lavrov leaned forward, his tone quiet yet piercing. "Let me remind you, Mark, my father fought so we could sit here today, to ensure Europe would never see war again. Yet your leaders seem to have forgotten that sacrifice." Silence engulfed the room as the weight of Lavrov's statement sank in, as if even the walls were absorbing the historical ghosts haunting their conversation. Lavrov then gestured toward an old map sprawled before him. Its lines outlining borders and histories once drawn in blood. "Look closely, Mark," he urged. "See how NATO's expansion has crept ever closer over the decades. If Russia were to position its military bases off the coasts of the United States, how would you perceive it?" This question, sharp as a knife, reflected the hypocrisy lurking in geopolitical maneuvers. Caught off guard, Ruda found his voice faltering. The room held its breath, every diplomat present felt the weight of their shared past pressing against them. Lavrov's narrative turned personal, intensified by the shadows lengthening along the walls. "You impose sanctions, claiming it strikes at Russia. But who suffers more? Your own people? They are left in the cold, wondering why their government has acted against their interests." Each statement cut deeper, reverberating within the consciousness of all present. Finally, he countered the justification for isolation with the stark truth of collective insecurity. In the 21st century, civilized nations should engage in dialogue, not confrontation. His voice softened, almost conspiratorial, "Yet, your citizens will question you soon, what was all this for?" The chilling prediction lingered in the air like an unfurling storm cloud. As shadows darkened the hall, there was a gravity to Lavrov's words that went beyond mere political rhetoric. This discussion had evolved into a profound confrontation of ideals, values, and historical truths, challenging those present to reconsider the narratives that shaped their choices. In the absence of easy answers, the exchange became a moment of reckoning. Would they seize the opportunity to redefine their future together, or would they remain trapped in a repeating cycle of enmity? Each pause echoed with anticipation, suggesting that neither Lavrov nor Ruda was willing to concede entirely. Their dance of diplomacy had just begun, hinting at twists yet to come. Earlier, Lavrov leaned forward, his voice deepened, echoing the weight of his nation's history. What if a single map could sever the arteries of Europe's economy in a heartbeat? "Mark," he began, "every empire, every alliance meets a moment of truth." The room felt heavy, the air tinged with polished wood and stale coffee. A choice, build the future or destroy it for an illusion of power. He spread a modern chart across the table. Bright lines traced trade routes, energy pipelines, rail tracks, lifelines of the continent. The paper smelled faintly of ink, the edges crisp under his fingers. "See these paths," he said, tapping the glowing veins. "They are the blood of today's markets." He lingered, eyes locked on the map, then let his gaze drift to the distant horizon beyond the vaulted ceiling. "Now imagine you cut these arteries yourself." A cold shiver seemed to sweep the hall. Who would benefit? Mark's mouth twitched, silence hanging like thick fog. His lips quivered, yearning to argue, yet fear held them still. "Russia has always been part of Europe," Lavrov continued, voice steady as steel. "Not just geography, but centuries of mutual aid. He recalled grain shipments that once toasted the air with fresh wheat, markets opened with a hopeful hum, soldiers standing shoulder to shoulder when war loomed. "What have we received in return?" he asked, his question resonating as if spoken by an entire people. "NATO's eastward expansion. Bases planted at our borders. Sanctions that choke our economies." He paused, letting the words settle like dust on ancient stone. "Tell me honestly, Mark, did this make your people happier? Did their lives improve?" His tone held no anger, yet each syllable struck harder than any accusation. Mark sank back, inhaled a strained breath, and whispered, "We acted to protect our values." Lavrov narrowed his eyes, a flash of hardened steel crossing his calm face. "Values," he repeated, "are not measured by bases or sanctions." He leaned closer, the scent of leather filling the space. "True values are built on trust and respect. When they are forged by humiliating a neighbor, they become tools of pressure, not principles." A soft, expectant hush fell over the room, as if everyone awaited a bell. "We offered a united European home. You turned it down." He swept his hand over the map, the inked lines trembling under his fingertips. "We offered equal dialogue. You chose blocks." The final pause stretched, the chandelier's light catching dust motes that hung like suspended questions. Lavrov's hand rested on the edge of the table, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Will you now listen, or will the next cup be yours?" The bells beyond the grand hall began to toll, their echo reverberating through the vaulted space, leaving the assembled diplomats suspended in a breathless, trembling silence. A quick recap. We once proposed a shared European home, you rejected it. We offered equal dialogue, you built blocks. Now, what crumbles when the night finally comes? The Berlin Barrier stood almost 3 decades, then fell in a single night. Will your newest walls meet the same fate? Lavrov's voice was calm, each syllable measured, his stare unyielding. The room felt heavy, the air tasting of stale cigar smoke, the carpet muffling every footfall. Ruda's jaw tightened, his eyes flickered with doubt, words dissolving before he could speak. A strange silence settled, not the gasp after a bell, but the quiet that waits for history itself to breathe. "Mark, travel back with me to the end of the Second World War," Lavrov began, his tone steady, never raised. Europe lay in ruins, cities charred, factories silent, millions homeless. The Soviet Union, bearing the deepest wounds, extended a hand. We built bridges, both stone and diplomatic, linking shattered towns. He traced an invisible line on the oak table, each fingerstroke echoing a forgotten promise. "Do you recall how Dutch streets saw Soviet soldiers marching beside your neighbors? Did France forget that without the Red Army the war's outcome might have shifted? Does Germany remember the forces that entered Berlin and ended fascism?" Ruda leaned forward, breath shallow, each question pressing like a weight on his shoulders. 27 million souls, more than a statistic, vanished, whole families erased, entire cities wiped from the map. Instead of retreat, we chose cooperation, sending technology, goods, and road crews throughout the 1950s and 60s. The room held its breath, the hum of the air conditioning disappearing as if the walls themselves were listening. What will Mark's response be when the past stands before him, unfiltered and relentless? At a high-profile meeting, tension crackled in the air as 2 world leaders squared off. Sergei Lavrov, a seasoned diplomat, faced Mark Rutte, the Prime Minister of the Netherlands. In this closed-door encounter, Lavrov's opening remarks struck like thunder, leaving silence in their wake. The room was charged with unspoken stakes. What revelation did Lavrov present that left Rutte speechless? Stay tuned, and you'll discover the shocking truth. As Lavrov leaned forward, the air seemed to thicken. "Mark, you are educated, a lover of history. Let me remind you of a promise made in the early 90s, he began, his voice low and gravelly. When the Soviet Union fell, there was a vow not to expand military blocs eastward. This was to create a safe and united Europe, free of dividing lines." A flicker of surprise passed through Ruda's eyes. Was he prepared to confront this long-held promise? Yet, Lavrov pressed on, articulating each point with the weight of history. Every decade saw your NATO boundaries creeping closer, he declared. What began as a handshake has turned into a fist raised toward Russia. You have welcomed new members to your alliance, shifting from promise to betrayal. The room fell silent, every diplomat keenly aware of the uncomfortable truth within Lavrov's words. Ruda finally stammered, "Sergei, times have changed. We face new threats now." But even he seemed to realize the emptiness of his defense. Lavrov, unfazed, leaned in closer, his voice softening. After World War II, Stalin offered a collective security system. A chance to build a united front against common threats. You turned it down. What did that yield? Decades of fear, armed races, divided families. Isn't it ironic, Mark? The question lingered. Ruda shifted uncomfortably, realizing the depth of Lavrov's argument. We lost millions in the war. Not just numbers, but lives, families, cities, dreams. Lavrov's gaze pierced through the tense atmosphere. It was a Soviet soldier who halted the tide of evil. The chilling silence allowed the gravity of the conversation to sink in. Ruda's defiance waned. He looked down, his hands trembling on the documents before him. You imposed sanctions, thinking they would hurt us, Lavrov accused, his tone now laced with bitterness. But they have harmed you too. Energy costs soared, factories closed, and millions of Europeans struggled to pay their bills. All this to reinforce a myth of a threat that never existed. The air in the room became heavy, filled with a palpable, aching silence. Lavrov continued, we once envisioned a house united, without walls separating us. Where people could thrive together. Instead, you chose walls. Ruda, visibly shaken, stammered, the world has changed, Sergei. We need new guarantees. Yet, his words lacked conviction, echoing hollowly. In that moment, Lavrov's voice dropped to an intimate tone, slicing through the tension. My father fought for a unified table where we could sit together. His blood was shed to ensure Europe did not see another war. But have your leaders remembered these sacrifices? Silence enveloped the room, with even Ruda unable to muster a response. Lavrov's voice resonated with sorrowful clarity as he shifted the dialogue toward deeper memories. You don't see me as a partner, do you? Yet, we shared our last grain during hardships. We believed in trust, in unity. And what did we receive in return? Weapons? Walls? How can you build peace without understanding the roots of fear? At this point, everyone in the room could feel the somber weight of history and future entwined in Lavrov's words. He paused, scanning the faces of the diplomats, before concluding, we seek a dialogue grounded in mutual respect, not in mistrust. We are all part of Europe. The finality of his statement left an indelible mark, shifting perceptions in the room and inviting a new, potentially transformative conversation about the future. How might this renewed understanding reshape alliances? What lies ahead as they navigate these turbulent waters? Stay tuned for the unfolding impact of this moment in history. The clash of two titans unfolded behind locked doors, where every whispered word echoed off vaulted ceilings like distant thunder. What could a seasoned diplomat say that would leave the NATO chief speechless, his mind locked in a grid of silence? The answer will shock you, and the fallout may reshape the whole continent. Summary of the opening. In a sealed hall, Sergei Lavrov faced NATO's top administrator, Marko Rutte, and launched an unexpected barrage. Lavrov sat upright, his dark suit a perfect silhouette against the dim light. A deep maroon tie highlighted the steel-gray lines around his eyes, each crease a relic of battles fought without guns. Across the table, Marko's smile was too wide, his jacket snug, his shoulders tense. The room felt heavy, the air thick with anticipation. Lavrov's voice lowered, gravelly, Marko, you cherish history, do you not? Remember the promise of the early 90s, no eastward march of military blocs, no NATO expansion, a shared safe Europe without dividing lines. He paused, letting each syllable settle like dust. Decade after decade you nudged your borders nearer to our frontiers, turning handshake into a clenched fist aimed at Russia. The silence that followed seemed to swallow the faint hum of ventilation. Marco's eyes flickered, his hands trembled over a folder. "The world has changed," he murmured, but his words rang hollow. Lavrov leaned forward, pointing to an aged map with faded borders. Rings of NATO's advance spread outward, each concentric circle a step closer to Russia. If Russia placed bases on the U.S. shores tomorrow, would you call it friendship or threat? Marco opened his mouth, but no sound escaped. The pause stretched, a rope tightening around every listener. Summary of the previous exchange: Lavrov reminded the NATO chief of broken promises, displayed a map of NATO's encroachment, and posed a daring hypothetical that left his opponent stranded for words. The diplomat's tone shifted, softer yet sharper than a blade. After the Great Patriotic War, Stalin offered a collective security system with the West, a united Europe, not a divided one. You refused, and instead built walls of fear, spending billions on missiles, tearing families apart with barbed wire. A faint tremor ran through Marco's fingers, the folder slipped, pages fluttering like wounded birds. Lavrov invoked the loss of 27 million souls in the Second World War, each number of family erased, a city turned to ash. Those soldiers stopped the Black Banner from spreading across Europe. They gave us a chance to live together. Now you speak of trust while your bases creep ever nearer. He let the words linger, the resonance filling the hall like a low drumbeat. Your sanctions hurt you more than us, Lavrov continued. Energy prices soar, factories shut, millions scramble for bills. All to preserve a myth of threat you fabricated yourself. He stared into Marco's eyes. Who truly feels safer now, Marco? The question hung, a knife poised to drop. Summary of the last blow: Lavrov painted the human cost of war, recalled Soviet sacrifices, and exposed the self-inflicted wounds of Western sanctions, leaving the NATO leader with a solitary, uneasy stare. A cold wind seemed to sweep the room as Lavrov rose, palms resting on the table, his presence expanding like a shadow over the candlelight. Russia does not seek enemies, we seek equal dialogue. We have always been part of Europe, trading, building, fighting side by side against common foes. He paused, his voice dropping to an intimate murmur. My father fought so we could sit together today. The soldiers of the Soviet Union gave Europe a future. Forgetting them guarantees repeated errors. Silence fell, dense enough to hear a lamp switch click somewhere in the corner. The translators halted mid-sentence, breaths held. Lavrov's final words cut through the quiet. Memory is our armor. Without it, we are doomed to repeat the past. The hall seemed to freeze, the weight of history pressing on every chair, every heart. The story ends on a breath held in the darkness, leaving the question: will the continent choose remembrance or repeat the folly of forgotten promises? A sudden, chilling question echoing through a marble hall. What single phrase could leave NATO's chief secretary speechless, his mouth frozen as if ice had sealed it shut? The answer arrived from a seasoned diplomat whose voice carried the weight of decades, his words striking the room like a hidden hammer. In the vaulted chamber, polished wood reflected every footstep, the air thick with the scent of old leather and the faint hum of distant ventilation. Sergei Lavrov sat upright, dark suit blending into the shadows, a deep maroon tie framing a face etched by countless negotiations. Across the table, Mark Rutte, the European premier, wore a forced smile that trembled under the pressure, his fingers drumming a nervous rhythm on a stack of files. The gathering was private, a secret that would later become whispered legend, attended only by those steering continents. Lavrov lowered his head, his voice low and gravelly, and began, Mark, you love history, do you not? Let me remind you, he spoke of the early 1990s, when promises were made that NATO would not push eastward, that a new Europe would rise without dividing lines. The hall fell silent, the only sound the occasional creak of a chair. The diplomat's words painted a picture of broken pledges, each new alliance inching closer to Russian borders, turning a handshake into a clenched fist. As he spoke, a cold draft slipped through the cracks, sending a shiver down the spines of those present. Rutte tried to answer, his voice wavering, but the weight of history pressed down on him, leaving him without a single line. What would happen if the tables were turned, if Russia placed bases at America's shores? The question hung in the air, unanswered, while a faint ticking seemed to count the seconds of inevitable confrontation. The previous exchange left the European table empty of confidence, its leaders suddenly aware of an invisible tether pulling them eastward. Lavrov leaned forward, eyes sharper than a winter wind, his gaze no longer aimed solely at Ruda but at the entire continent. Who truly decides Europe's trade routes, its energy supplies, the march of its armies? The answer, he warned, is not in the glossy conference rooms but in the loss of autonomy. Europe, he declared, has become a tool, its promises of unity now a chain binding its own people. A ripple of irritation passed through the diplomats, their eyes betrayed the frustration beneath calm facades. He reminded them of the promised collective security after the war, a system that could have avoided the arms race of the Cold War. Instead, billions were poured into missiles and tanks, families split by barbed wire, fear-gripping generations. The memory of 27 million lives lost in the Second World War resurfaced, not as numbers but as vanished towns, mothers, children. Who stopped the Black Banner in Europe? Lavrov asked, his voice soft yet cutting. The room seemed to inhale, the scent of old paper mixing with the faint bitterness of stale coffee. Ruda's hand tightened around the dossier, his composure cracking as he realized the depth of the accusation. Could Europe truly claim independence when every major decision echoed across an ocean? Aligned with distant powers? Lavrov's tone steadied, each pause a deliberate breath, as he laid a weathered map before them, its edges frayed, lines of NATO expansion drawn like concentric rings drawing ever closer to Russian soil. Imagine, he whispered, if Russian forces reached your doorstep, would you see this as friendship or threat? The question lingered, the silence louder than any shouted rebuttal, and the diplomats felt the walls of the hall close in, the weight of history pressing against their throats. Following the tense map display, Lavrov rose slowly, his hands resting on the chair's back, his eyes scanning the room one final time. You call sanctions a shield, he said, yet you strike yourself. Energy prices surged, factories shuttered, millions scrambling to pay bills, all consequences of a self-inflicted wound. He spoke of a vision once held, a Europe without walls, a shared home where peoples could thrive together. Instead, block after block rose, each new base, each missile a step deeper into distrust. The air grew heavy with the smell of old wood and faint ozone, as if the room itself sensed the impending storm. Lavrov's voice softened, almost intimate, as he recalled his father's sacrifice, the blood shed so Europe might never know another war. We offered dialogue, a pact of indivisible security, he murmured, but you turned it into a threat. The final words hung suspended, the ticking of a hidden clock echoing louder than any applause. As the doors to the grand hall creaked shut, a distant bell rang. Its solemn toll marking the end of a conversation that had become a reckoning. The ambassadors sat, eyes lowered, hands resting on paperwork that now felt meaningless, waiting for the next move in a game where the stakes were not merely borders, but the very soul of a continent. At a private meeting only moments ago, a tense encounter unfolded between Sergei Lavrov and NATO Secretary-General Mark Rutte. Lavrov's words resonated powerfully in the room, leaving Rutte speechless. What words could have had such an impact? As we embark on this intriguing narrative, prepare to be captivated. The high-ceilinged hall was charged with a palpable tension. Individuals in tailored suits sat around a long table, their faces etched with strain, though they masked their unease behind well-practiced diplomatic facades. Yet, one figure exuded a gravity that drew all eyes, Sergei Lavrov, whose stoic demeanor commanded respect. With a gaze that revealed decades of experience and calculated confidence, he sat composed, his dark suit immaculate but understated. His deep burgundy tie contrasted with his pallor, each wrinkle around his eyes telling tales of countless negotiations and quiet battles. Across from him, Mark Rutte, the European Prime Minister, sported an overly broad smile that felt forced in such a serious discussion. He drummed his fingers nervously against a file of paperwork, his jacket appearing hastily tailored. The tension was electric, almost suffocating. This gathering was shrouded in secrecy, devoid of journalists. Only the voices that determined the fate of continents filled the air. Lavrov inclined his head slightly, greeting Ruda, before his low, gravelly voice cut through the silence. Mark, you're an educated man, I believe you appreciate history? A pause lingered, intensifying the moment. Let me remind you, he continued. As the early 90s unfolded and the USSR disintegrated, Lavrov recalled promises made: military blocs would not advance eastward, NATO would not expand. The room hung on his words. Ruda's brow lifted slightly, as if to interject, but Lavrov pressed on, his voice deepening with the weight of history. Yet each decade brought you closer to our borders, forging a fist where once there was a handshake. The metaphor hung in the air, stark and heavy. In that moment, the atmosphere shifted. Even the hum of the ventilation system seemed to be swallowed by the silence. Ruda finally summoned the courage to respond. Sergei, times have changed. We face new challenges. But there was little conviction in his voice, merely the echo of his fears. Lavrov, leaning in ever so slightly, countered softly, let's not forget Stalin's proposal after the war for a joint security framework. Regret and missed opportunities lingered in the air. You chose walls, not bridges, Lavrov continued, his voice resonating with haunting solemnity. The audience felt the weight of his words pressing down. History remembers, Lavrov stated, we lost 27 million lives in World War II. Not just numbers, Mark, these are families forever altered. In this silence, the Prime Minister's silence spoke volumes, revealing vulnerability. His fingers clenched the paperwork tightly, almost desperately, as he processed the emotional force of Lavrov's words. The impact of Lavrov's call to acknowledge shared history and responsibility hung palpably in the air. Gazing at the old map before him, he gently pointed out the stark outlines that depicted NATO's encroachment on Russian borders, an undeniable truth. If Russia were to place its bases off your shores today, how would you respond? With trust or fear? Ruda's mouth opened, yet no sound emerged. His cheeks flushed as he grasped the implications of Lavrov's challenge, the vulnerability laid bare. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation, each diplomat in the room shifted their gaze from Lavrov to Ruda, caught in the weight of the moment. Your sanctions were crafted as a blow against Russia, Lavrov continued, yet they land heavily on your own citizens. His voice softened, revealing a deeper understanding. Who benefits from fear and isolation, Mark? Who wins in a world divided? The Prime Minister displayed a blend of weariness and frustration, yet remained silent. Lavrov's words unfolded like a deliberate symphony, each cadence striking harder than the last. People desire safety built on trust rather than fear. Your actions suggest otherwise. As Lavrov's criticisms brushed against Ruda's defenses, the tension shifted again. We have offered dialogue, but your fortress mentality won't yield a sustainable peace. What will your people say when they realize the price of this division? The sound in the room was almost deafening in its silence. Ruda lowered his eyes, unable to respond to the truth laid bare before him. With the weight of memory and experience in his tone, Lavrov reiterated, we are Europeans, Mark. Our fates are intertwined. Will you choose partnerships or fortifications? As he leaned back, Lavrov let the gravity of his assertion settle amidst the uneasy silence, his gaze penetrating, leaving Ruda to confront the complex reality they faced together. Would they build bridges or let the walls rise ever higher? In a high-stakes setting, a closed-door meeting revealed the intense clash between two powerful figures, Sergei Lavrov and Mark Ruda. Moments ago, Lavrov left NATO's Secretary-General speechless with his piercing words that echoed in the hushed room. What did Lavrov say that caused such a reaction? Why did his speech resonate with such gravity? Stick around as we delve into this gripping tale that challenges not just politics but our very understanding of history and trust. The grand hall was steeped in tension, each footstep echoing like a heartbeat in the silence. Seated at a long table draped in impeccable white cloth, diplomats readied themselves, their expressions masked in practiced neutrality. Yet, one presence stood out, Sergei Lavrov. His gaze carried the weight of time, a seasoned diplomat embodying years of intricate negotiations. Clad in a tailored dark suit, he appeared both formidable and unyielding. Opposite him sat Mark Rutte, whose forced smile felt incongruous against the room's palpable tension, his fingers nervously drumming on a folder. The atmosphere thickened, electric with unsaid words. This was more than a meeting, it was a colliding of narratives, a potential flashpoint in history. No press was allowed, ensuring the gravity of the encounter remained concealed from the world. Yet, as Lavrov tilted his head with a resolute demeanor, he began his address in a resonant, gravelly tone. "Mark, as a learned man, you appreciate history, don't you? Let me remind you," he paused, ensuring his words carved into the moment, in the early 90s, as the Soviet Union crumbled. Assurances were made. NATO would not expand eastward, allowing space for a new, unified Europe, without dividing lines. Rutte's brow furrowed, perhaps he meant to challenge, but Lavrov pressed on, his voice deepening. "But with each decade, you shifted your borders closer to ours. What began as friendship morphed into a fist raised against Russia. How can you ask for trust when you've continually encroached on our territory?" His metaphor hung in the air, weighty and poignant, echoing in the stillness, demanding reflection. Rutte gathered himself, responding with hesitance, his conviction lacking. "Sergei, the world has changed. New threats demand new strategies." His words felt hollow, echoing a manufactured backdrop devoid of substance. Lavrov leaned in, persistent yet calm. "Let me remind you further. After the war, Stalin proposed a collective security system with you, to prevent a divided Europe and a new arms race. But you turned away." As Lavrov's voice articulated the catastrophic cost of those decisions, he invoked memories of loss. 27 million lives lost in the shadows of World War II were more than mere statistics, they were families, dreams, and futures extinguished. The silence that followed was palpable, even the translators paused, caught in the gravity of remembrance. Then came his quiet challenge: if Russia were to position its military around the United States, wouldn't you perceive it as a threat? Rutte opened his mouth to respond but faltered, trapped by the reality of the situation. Breaking the silence, Lavrov turned to the old map before them, marked with NATO's advancing borders, and said, clearly, "Every decade, your bases moved closer." Unasked, he allowed the statement to linger. "Tell me, Mark, how would such actions be viewed?" Rutte's face flushed, a portrait of conflict painted in real time. The room was an audience to palpable tension, a battleground of ideas and ideologies. The silence had morphed from discomfort to reflection. Lavrov straightened, and as he did, the very weight of history seemed to join him. "We do not seek enemies, Mark. Russia desires equitable dialogue." His voice approached an intimate level, sharing historical scars and hopes intertwined. "In hardship, we shared our last crumbs of bread, but what have we received in return?" The question hung heavily, threading the needle of the past into the present, elucidating pain and trust, a conversation reaching far beyond geopolitical strategies. "The security built on fear inevitably breeds new dangers," Lavrov stated, noting the ever-present humanity beyond military posturing. "You built walls without realizing people live within them." A world of emotions washed over the audience, captivated by his sincerity. As he rose, he brought forth a spirit transcending protocol, a call to remember the bonds forged through history, unity over division. "We aspired for partnership, for a bridge." His voice, steady yet rich with nostalgia, echoed the unresolved connections of shared sacrifices. The meeting might have concluded, but its weight lingered, a stark reminder that true diplomacy lies not in power plays but in remembrance. The evening deepened beyond the figures in the hall, where shadows danced across walls, a reminder of choices made, and ones yet to come. How will history remember this moment? Will bridges be built, or will walls continue to rise? The choice remains with us all. Just moments ago, the tension in the grand hall froze time itself. The voices of leaders faded into a heavy silence as Sergei Lavrov's words echoed, not just toward a single opponent, but toward history itself. His tone carried a weight that went beyond politics. He said, "We have always believed in dialogue. We sought equality. We wanted Europe as a partner, not as an adversary. But what did you do? You turned outstretched hands into targets. The room, filled with figures in sharp suits, fell utterly quiet. No one interrupted, no one dared to speak. Lavrov's eyes scanned the assembly, steady and unwavering. Let me be clear, Russia is not the enemy. Russia is a part of Europe. Together, we built cities, traded goods, and shed blood for freedom. Yet you chose to erase that from memory. You rewrote the past to justify your actions today. Reaching into his pocket, he pulled out a small, worn medallion. Its enamel bore cracks like frozen scars of the past. He placed it gently on the table. This belonged to my father. He lived through war, witnessed death and destruction. And he told me, the most important thing is that this never happens again. That is why we must be at the same table. That is why our peoples must build the future together. A thick, almost audible silence settled over the room. Mark Ruta's eyes dropped. His lips moved but no words came. His silence was louder than any argument. Breaths were taken cautiously, as if everyone sensed they stood at a historic crossroads. This was no ordinary meeting, it was the moment that would echo through time. Lavrov clasped the medallion tightly and fixed his gaze on those present. We do not want new walls. We refuse to live surrounded by suspicion and threats. Russia has always stood for cooperation. But cooperation is only possible when both sides remember the price of peace. His eyes swept slowly across the room. My father fought so that we could sit here, at this table, talking, while they shot. So that we could build, while others destroyed. You can argue and make excuses, but the truth remains, people long for peace. Anyone who forgets that is doomed to lose. His words lingered in the vaulted chamber, as if the stone archways themselves carried them upward into shadowed vaults where forgotten histories dwell. Ruta made no reply, only a quiet nod, an acknowledgement that any rebuttal now would be hollow. The hall sank into a profound silence, a silence filled with meaning, heavy with the ghosts of the past and the uneasy promise of the future. The vaulted hall seemed to breathe, stone arches lifting every word toward darkness. A heavy silence settled, echoing past conflicts and future worries. Did that hush truly mute every objection, or did it sharpen the tension further? In that charged pause, each participant realized the true weight of diplomacy. It was no longer merely ink on paper, it became a living memory passed through generations. What choice will the present generation make when history leans on their shoulders? And in that instant, everyone there grasped a deeper truth. Diplomacy is more than documents and signatures. It is memory, carried across ages, shaping the decisions made right now. The room smelled faintly of polished oak and old leather, a reminder of countless negotiations that had come before. A faint hum of the ventilation blended with the rustle of pages, creating an almost tangible tension. Listeners who feel this story close to their hearts, who believe in the power of words, in the price of remembrance, and in the future built by our own hands, are invited to share their own experiences in the comments. Your voice adds life to these narratives, turning memory into something vibrant. Will you let your story echo through the vaulted arches, joining the chorus of those who refuse to forget?